2013. The case study started off with this chart, balance of payments, inflation, investment, oil prices, index numbers. We've done this one in the lesson. It went from 45 to 125. We'll come back to that calculation in a little bit. It shows the oil price rising and then steeply falling in the recession and then rising again, with a little slowdown towards the end. The case study itself is looking at the UK's deficit on the current account of the balance of payments, so essentially a trade deficit. It talks about the exchange rate of the UK falling by 25% during the recession. It does talk about exports increasing because of that, up by 21%. However, the volume of imports has also risen, so we have still got a trade deficit, even though it may have shrunk slightly. The next paragraph talks a little bit about some of the reasons why maybe the balance of payments hasn't improved so much. It's talked about the effects of the weaker exchange rate on inflation there. It also says that they had inaccurate estimates, so they were based on inaccurate data. It says here, perhaps after the long contraction in UK manufacturing, some goods are no longer made in the UK, so we have a loss of our comparative advantage or a loss of a specialisation. British manufacturers have entirely abandoned some markets, particularly those for products that are labour intensive. That links into that point. And it gives an example there of, in 1997, UK producers made 16 and 22% of all leather goods, and clothing sold in the country in 2009, these markets were 6% and 8%. Manufacturing goods in the UK often necessitates imports of raw materials, so even though manufacturers may export, they may import at the same time. The dependency on overseas suppliers is partly explained by the fact that many manufacturers agreed long-term supply contracts with cheaper overseas suppliers before the depreciation of sterling. So this long-term contract might also link back to the fact that we might not be seeing the benefits of a weaker exchange rate because we're still tied in to buy goods from abroad. The Bank of England also noted that there is still a large price differential with countries such as China, India, even after sterling's depreciation. So what that's saying is that they are still, as it might be cheaper relatively, China are still cheaper in absolute terms. Furthermore, many UK manufacturers learned long ago to compete on brand and quality, so actually our goods and services, while they may be slightly more expensive or more expensive than China and India, they're a better quality. However, this hints that things might start to change as the lower exchange rates and other factors have an impact on strategic decisions. Many manufacturers are discussing bringing parts of their production back home because of high wage inflation. So that last paragraph's really kind of talking about time there. The extract 2 part of it talks about investment and corporation tax. Business investment as a share GDP fell, so we know that investment is falling. It's got a key figure there, 13% to 8%. And with GDP, previous government reduced corporation tax, a tax on company profits, from 30% to 28% in 2008. The current Chancellor is gradually reducing it further to 21% by 2014, which he hopes will increase investment by between 5 and 10% per annum. So what you have is an example here of a supply side policy. And then you've got examples on this graph of relative rates. So even if the UK gets down to 21%, Russia is still cheaper, but most other countries have much higher, especially Germany up here at 30, and even the US here up at 40. So there may be some other reasons, not just corporation tax, why businesses may invest. If we look at the questions here, so the first question was referring to the data, calculate the index number for the oil price in March 2012. This was the one that we did in class. What we've got here on the answer is 125 divided by 45. But then there was also a division of 100 there as well, which means that you end up with 125 over 0.45, and that's why there's just the 2.7 here, and initially it just went to 102.7. Without that, it would be 127.777, and then that would be added on to get that figure, which was the correct answer. So the index number was 277.77. If we go back to the last question, the next question, with reference to figure 1, explain 2 possible ways in which changes in the world economy could cause the movements in the oil price shown. So if we look back at that chart there, we said before there's an increase in price, a fall in price, an increase in price. You do have some small fall in prices as well. It's a supply and demand linked question here. In terms of world oil prices, you're either looking at increases in demand for the periods where demand prices rising, or reductions in supply may be causing the same effect. So if we have a look at the answer here, one reason for oil prices rising, and we've got a specific reference here, so we've got a little bit of A there, maybe as a result of rising inflation levels in the country who are exporting the oil. For example, China saw significant rise in inflation, then it means that the relative price for other countries to import will rise as a consequence. The price will rise for other countries, pushing up the price. A little bit too vague, this one. I think it would have been better if it had talked about economic growth in China causing increases in wages, and that leading through to the rise in the price of oil, and then the rise of the imports over here. The extent to which inflation will have a consequence. If we look back at the question, it's only an explain question, so we don't need an evaluation point. So this part here, the extent to which, isn't needed. If we go up, an alternative reason as to why the price of oil fell in July, so we've got another bit of application there from the case study. Result of a depreciation in the exchange rate in a country exporting oil. If the exchange rate falls, then it means that the exports become relatively cheaper for other countries as a result. The relative price of oil will fall. One of the reasons why a lot of this question is too vague is if we go back to the question, it says with reference to the figure 1, explain 2 reasons why the change in world economy, so the world economy is the key focus of the question. In this answer, what we have is domestic things, so an exchange rate of one country, and the original one as well is talking about an inflation in the countries where they're exporting oil. Now that one's a little bit better because it's talking about the countries from where they're exporting oil, but one point of clarity is that the price of oil is a global price. So countries can't sell oil at a different price to the price that it is the world price of oil. So the price of a barrel of oil in dollars is the same that anyone can charge. Now if things change within a country and your inflation was going up, you'd still have to sell your oil for the price that it's on the world market. So these have to be global reasons that we're looking at here. So again, that one's a bit too vague. The better ones to talk about could be global economic growth. So just to put in the word global would increase the demand for oil in most countries, and that increase in demand would increase the price of oil in that market. You could also talk about things like wars in the areas of the world, so North Africa or the Middle East, which would reduce the supply of oil, and that would lift the price as well. There's a few marks on that question for application, but it's the specific of that question in terms of the world impact. The next question, using aggregate demand and supply, assess So it's an evaluation question. The effect on the UK economy. So the effects are going to be positive and negative because of that assess part of the rise in oil prices. So oil is a significant import. And we'll probably be looking at things linked to businesses around this question. So let's have a look at the answer. Bit of application again. We've got the rise in oil prices here. As the UK tends to import oil rather than export it, it will have a damaging consequence. So another bit of A there. On the balance of payments current account, as the price of imports rise and the UK tends to demand oil for cars and production, means that the value of imports rises. As a consequence of this, net exports falls because of full negative demand. Very good analysis, A1 and A2. The graph itself shows the fall in aggregate demand. Then we've got a bit more here, consequence of the fall in aggregate demands, fall in real national output, fall in short-run economic growth, and also a rise in unemployment. So very good analysis of one potential negative of that. However, the extent to which rising oil prices have a detrimental effect on the UK will depend upon the relative value of exports, as the UK has their top exports in high-value financial services and manufactured capital. The value of these goods and services may outweigh the rise in the value of imports, meaning that the trade balance might not get any worse. So we've got an example of a point there. One of the benefits of a rise in oil prices might be that the government may become closer to its target of protecting the environment. A rise in the price of oil can mean that firms' cost of production may rise, and as a result they may turn to greener technology such as wind or solar energy. As a result, less fossil fuels will be burned. So we've got a little bit of a cost and a benefit in there. You've got the rise in the cost of production, which would be a cost to the economy, but you've got an overall link to other macroeconomic objectives. However, this may be unlikely to happen as the costs faced by firms to move their production might not be as high incentive, therefore government might need to intervene through subsidies. A little bit too vague, this one. It's starting to kind of go into micro-analysis. It's starting to look like a market failure is trying to solve negative externality question. So we just need to be careful that we focus on the question. I think we've got most of what will be needed for that question anyway. Alternative ways to do that question would be looking at the rise in the cost of production for businesses and looking at the negative of that in terms of less output for a business or potential output, and maybe less investment likely going forwards. Question B1, with reference to the extract, define a deficit in the trade of goods and services on the current account of balance of payments. The fact it says with reference to the extract means it would like you to give some examples of how this might have occurred. So if we go back quickly to this part of it, deficit on the current account and the balance of payments, we do have those percentages in here, that even if the volumes are up 21%, the volumes of imported goods could also increase. But the word volume is a bit misleading because we want to talk about values. So if we just go back to the answer, deficit on the current account is when the value of imports is larger than the value of exports. We've got our key definition there. As the extract states, a fall in exchange rate would lead to a rise in the value of exports, reducing the trade deficit. A little bit more needed to this. Some of the examples of those increases and decreases, the percentages, would add a bit more in terms of application marks to that question. The next question, explain two likely costs. So just explain, doesn't need to be two sides. Likely costs to the UK economy, so negatives of a sustained deficit in the trade of goods and services on the current account of the balance of payments. So it's a trade deficit, and what are the negative impacts? Two separate ones, 8 marks, so 4 marks for each. Trade deficit, don't need a definition in this type of question. So the K part specifically in this type of question where it specifically says to, when you again asked to explain it, you don't need a definition. It's just the K part is the costs that you would incur. Trade deficit is when the value of one problem of the UK economy of a trade deficit is the dependency on overseas suppliers. As the UK has become dependent on imports from other countries such as raw materials, it means that the UK is, if one of the countries who are the most, okay, what this is kind of focusing on is more the cause of the deficit rather than a cost or a negative. So the fact we depend on other countries is going to lead to the deficit occurring. It's not necessarily a negative of having a trade deficit. Second issue, in being a sustained trade deficit, the UK becomes less internationally competitive. The UK becomes less desirable for firms to invest. Okay, again, this is more a cause of the deficit rather than an effect. Then we've got a bit of a valuation here in terms of however, so we don't need this. The likely negatives of a trade deficit come from the fact that from one point of view, and it was analysed a little bit earlier on, there's a fall in aggregate demand, because in terms of x minus m, as the m is greater than the x, there's a negative effect on aggregate demand, and you can analyse that with the diagram here and talk about how it leads to a rise in unemployment due to the fall in output of businesses. You can then do another cost linked to that in terms of the government, because they would be in effect lower corporation tax and lower income tax payments because of that, and that could lead to a budget deficit for the government as well. And I think those would be better ways to analyse the costs of the deficit in the trade balance over time. You could maybe even take the unemployment and the lower output, the lower unemployment down to an individual and talk about lower standards of living because of less income within the UK. You can also talk about the effect on the circular flow of income if you want to add another layer up here, because that would mean that leakages are greater than injections on that aspect. If we look at the next question with reference to extract 1, so again the one around the trade balance, assess two sides, the likely effect, so positives and negatives, of a fall in the sterling rate, and we know this was 25%, that's the key application, on the UK's deficit in the trade of goods and services. So the effect on the trade in goods and services is either going to be that the deficit remains large, or the deficit gets smaller, or we end up somehow in a surplus. It's a valuation, so we kind of need to look at some of the things which are linked into that in terms of how likely that is to happen. Okay, so the exchange rate is the value of one currency in terms of another. We've got our K mark there, and we've got the boosting of exports, so we've got an A mark there. The reason for the weaker exchange rate means that the relative price of UK exports falls for other countries and the value of UK exports rise, so we're analysing now. Due to the surge in demand, a weaker exchange rate makes it more expensive for UK consumers to import. Another accurate point, as a result, more likely to switch to domestic consumption. Another good analysis point, reducing the value of imports. Both these factors can be said to boost net trade, causing a decline in the trade deficit for the UK. So perfect one-sided analysis of why that's likely to benefit the trade balance. However, as extract 1 also states, Britain manufactures almost entirely in band in some markets. So now we're into the evaluation. As a result of some commodities have to be imported regardless of their price. A bit more evaluation. Therefore, these products, a weakening of the exchange rate may lead to a rise in the value of imports, counterbalancing the rise in the value of exports, which could lead to the trade balance either unchanged or potentially worsening. As an AS student, you haven't studied Marshall Lerner condition, so don't worry about this part, but as an A2 student, if you're watching this, The Marsh-Lerner condition, the extent to which the depreciation exchange rate will improve the trade balance, will depend upon the elasticities of imports and exports. If the sum exceeds 1, i.e. are price elastic, then the depreciation will be an improvement on the trade balance. Excellent way to finish that evaluation. But as an AS student, you could just talk about the changes may take time, especially around those contracts. It mentions that there's contracts signed up for in the short term, so we'd still be buying the imports at a higher rate. The last question says, using the information provided and your knowledge, assess, and it would be much more likely that this would be discussed in the papers you will see, but evaluative question, the use of supply side policies, including a reduction in corporation tax. So it's wanting at least 2 policies, one of which has to be reduction in corporation tax, as a means of increasing the UK's economic growth. So that's the target you're trying to achieve. If it's assess, you're looking at the reason why corporation tax would increase economic growth, the reason why it might not, one other supply side policy, the reason why it would, the reason why it might not. In your paper, it's likely to be the 20 or the 25 mark question. Therefore, it's going to need some kind of conclusion. Probably more likely to be an evaluate question as well. Okay. Supply side policies is one put in place with the intention of causing a rise in long run aggregate supply. In other words, an increase in the productive capacity. Nice accurate definition there. As extract 2 states, business investment fell nearly 13%. One reason for the fall in business investment may be due to high corporation tax. Bit of application there. Percentage taken off profits, definition of corporation tax. Corporation tax reduces the incentive for firms to invest, and as a consequence firms will invest elsewhere, therefore reducing corporation tax is a larger incentive for firms to invest. Here 1. Furthermore, lower corporation tax can attract foreign direct investment, a little bit more. As a result of investment, there are more injections into the circular flow of income, leading to higher levels of investment can lead to a rise in the productive capacity of an economy, which in turn can lead to more jobs to fulfill investment projects, resulting in a rise in real GDP. So now we've answered the specific question, causing long-term economic growth. One thing that could be relevant here, just as an extra mark, a long-run aggregate supply graph. And then that could have been linked in terms of the long-run economic growth or the rise in output. We could have just analysed that very quickly using the graph there. However, on the other hand, reducing corporation tax means that there's less tax revenue going into the government budget. As a result, it might worsen the budget deficit and create an opportunity cost for the government. A lack of government funding may lead to the government reducing their spending, which will cause a fall in aggregate demand. And we've got an analysis here. So we're starting from this equilibrium to that one. Yes. And then we've got the analysis there showing the fall, so a less effective supply side policy. As a result, a low and reducing corporation tax might not be effective, however used alongside expansionary monetary policy. Now this is a good way of evaluating, but at the end, after another supply side policy, let's just see where this goes. Economic growth. However, the government must be careful, as both of these policies there could lead to large inflationary pressure, which in the long term could lead to... I think this is getting a little bit off topic in terms of the monetary policy being less effective in the long term. If we add monetary policy to make fiscal policy effective, we don't want to evaluate monetary policy further. An alternative supply side policy, so here we've got the second one. Could we invest in education and training? So we've got a human capital one as well as a business one. Increasing the skills of workers will make higher quality goods and services. Okay. So by increasing the skills and abilities of workers in the UK, it means that higher quality goods and services can be produced. As we are looking at the focus being economic growth, one thing that we could add in here is that the quality of the labour factor of production has increased, and that is the thing that allows greater output or an increase in productivity per person. So you could write an increase in output per person or an increase in productivity, which that then gives you the increase in the productive capacity of the economy. And then that could be linked back to the supply side policy leading to economic growth. Let's just come back to this. So the quality of goods and services would be better if it was applied to a balance of payments question, because then that increases exports. Alongside that, the workers will become more productive, reducing the unit labour costs of the UK. Both these factors increase international competitiveness. As a result, the more of UK exports will be demonstrated injections. So we've got one there that does link into economic growth in terms of aggregate demand rising. So that could be a short-term economic growth argument, causing a rise in economic growth. However, the extent to which education and training will be effective policy leading to economic growth will depend upon the relative skills and education levels of other countries. The UK may become absolutely more productive, or they may not become relatively more productive. Furthermore, spending on education and training can be taken away. Government spending on infrastructure, which could also increase economic growth, and therefore once again create an opportunity cost for the government. I think there's a different way to write that part about still another country might have a more skilled workforce than us. So Germany's workforce, even with spending on education, might still be more skilled. I think a better way of doing the argument against here is a skills mismatch. So what you would say is that, just as an example or application, we might train people in engineering, but there's no jobs available, either because of the lack of demand or because of lack of investment. And then what you have is you're creating structural unemployment, or more accurately, underemployment. So the people may take jobs that are lower skilled, doctor working in McDonald's or an engineer working in Subway. And I think that would be a more applicable argument in terms of linking to economic growth. So that would lead to lower levels of aggregate demand, so that the economic growth would be there, but it wouldn't be to the same extent. In conclusion, supply side policies can be an effective way of promoting economic growth alone. However, the fact that most policies reduce the level of government funding and revenue means that in the long term it may not be sustainable and may lead to long-run aggregate supply snapping back to its original position. As a result, the combination of supply-side policy and expansionary monetary policy may be a more appropriate method. Now, I think that this last part here about linking it together could be done a little bit differently, in terms of looking at monetary policy creating the investment due to low interest rates, and this creating the jobs, as well as the corporation tax also causing more investment and more jobs. And then you've got the consumption as well, which would increase, and then you have the double shift in long-run aggregate supply and in aggregate demand, giving you stable long-term economic growth. I think that would have been a slightly better way. There's E3 in here, there is a judgment there, but that would be a slightly better way of doing that one. And overall that question is quite strong, so it does cover most of the things there, just a little bit of accuracy on that last question.